And I think that's the crux of our interests as Indigenous people, is how do we get those interests on the table and in some significant way agreed to.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Sands. He is the oat milk to my chai latte. He is the peanut butter to my toast, the avocado to my toast, maybe, Chris. Anyway, welcome, Chris. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Scotty, and you're making me hungry already.
There you go. Well, listen, one of the things I love about Canusa Street is the opportunity to dive into issues, maybe dive into the deep end of issues that we don't necessarily think about every day in our daily work on Canada-U.S. relations. And one of the ones that you and I have been talking about on this podcast, and that is a subject of very important discussions between Canada and the United States, is the Columbia River Treaty. I'm excited about our guest today. He brings a perspective that is much needed, and his expertise and his insights into the negotiations and what it's all about, I think, are something that our listeners will really benefit from. So with that, Chris, let me turn it over to you to introduce our guest and to reintroduce this issue, which we've talked about a couple of times, but we've now got a different lens on it, which I think is much needed.
A very much needed lens, talking about the First Nations' role in the Columbia River Treaty. And our guest today is fantastic. Strategist, negotiator, and spokesperson for the First Nations peoples, Nathan Matthew has focused on quality education for Aboriginal people for more than 35 years. He's a leader in the local, provincial, and national dialogue on self-determination for Aboriginal education. He served 2 terms as chairman of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council. And he's currently the Secwépemc representative to the Columbia River Treaty negotiations, which concluded its 12th round in January. So this is a long-term negotiation, and we've got somebody who's been with it since the beginning. Welcome, Chief Nathan Matthew. Maybe you can start by pronouncing all of those First Nations names properly.
I'm a member of the Secwépemc First Nation, which is part of the Secwépemc First Nation, which is also known as the Shuswap Nation. So I live in a First Nations community. I was raised here, and went away for an education. Got a lot of experience, and came back home, and have been here since 1980 or so, and have been very, very privileged to be a part of the representation on council, to do all kinds of interesting things in terms of community development, moving with the politics for the nation, the Secwépemc Nation, and being involved for many years in education developments locally and nationally. And then in the last couple of years, I've been really focused a lot of my attention on land issues, title and rights issues. So I'm currently an advisor to the Secwépemc First Nation on title and rights issues, as well as self-government. And I was selected by the Secwépemc chiefs of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council to represent them in the Columbia River Treaty. So been involved with the Columbia River Treaty from about 2014, 16, and then we got more formally involved as our relationship evolved with the national and provincial governments in terms of getting representation with respect to our interests at the negotiating table. So, yeah, a very, very interesting environment to work in. And of course, to me, the significant issue is, how do we maintain a relationship with the Canadian and the provincial governments in this era of reconciliation, because in Canada, the rights and the title of First Nations people or Indigenous nations has really changed in the last 50 years. And so there are new opportunities for Indigenous people to become self-determining, self-governing, but all within a very colonial kind of environment. The laws, even though the laws say the governments are going to recognize our rights and our title and our right to self-determination, that's not always as easy to do if you don't have the laws changed to accommodate that. So that's, I think, where we're in that kind of environment, and not just for the Columbia River Treaty, but all land and resource-based initiatives, whether it be mining, forestry, water issues, air issues, climate change. So there's quite an array of areas for Indigenous people to become involved in and really become more responsible for, and sort of represent ourselves in a positive way, and become part of what we take seriously in terms of relationships and reconciliation. How do we reconcile the rights and the title of Indigenous people with the jurisdiction and the laws of the non-Indigenous people? So national, provincial, and local. So yeah, very active area to be involved in, and it's always changing. So it's not like we have the British common law that's been there for the last 1,000 years. We've got a chance to talk about our own laws, because that's what, on the Canadian side anyway, the laws of Indigenous people are to be respected and exercised. And so it's been many, many years since we've had traditional laws. Of course, that goes back a couple hundred years. But now that we have the opportunity to represent ourselves, our core values as Indigenous people, the values that make us who we are and provide us with that identity, we have now freedom to explore that, write it down, talk about it amongst ourselves. And in some cases, we're starting to write it out. And that becomes our law. And in our case, for the Secwépemc people, we call that our Secwépemc, our law, our good way of living, and the rules that apply to ourselves. So we're developing that. So that's all exciting. And so are the other nations. We're, of course, with the Columbia River Treaty, we have the Syilx, the Okanagan people, and the Tunaka, those in the Kootenay area. So that's what we have, and this is unique as well, is that the three nations have agreed to work together to present a common front, a common position or positions to the negotiations of the Columbia River Treaty. So that's not as simple as it sounds, because we are different nations, but for these purposes, we've agreed to work together, and that really is a new thing, and it certainly provides a lot of strength when we can move forward in that way.
You know, that's incredibly helpful context to put this whole conversation into. So I appreciate that very much. And let me just start there, if I could, Chief. I have to call you Chief. I have a respect for the positions. You know, every former member of Congress and ambassador from the United States holds their title forever. So, and you have had several very distinguished positions, but you mentioned your appointment and your position vis-a-vis negotiating Columbia River Treaty. So you talked about, the three nations at the table. How are you thinking about the Columbia River Treaty negotiation as it stands today? Are British Columbia, Canada, and the nations that you're representing completely aligned? versus the United States, or is it more complicated than that when you think about where the positions are and where the equities lie?
Well, I think in the broad picture, the renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty has a couple more elements in it than it did initially, beyond 50 years ago. Initially, it was just power generation and flood control. Those are the two elements. And for the last 50 or so years, those interests have been very fine-tuned in terms of that joint shared use of the water in the Columbia Basin. And in the last number of years, there's been a real interest in ecological values. The creation of the dams and the reservoirs under the Columbia River Treaty was quite devastating in terms of the ecology. I guess over many millennia, the basin had evolved into intact ecological areas that supported a very large variety of plants, animal species, and of course the humans certainly had an interest and lived in those areas. So that's the challenge, is to introduce ideas about how can we improve the health of the ecological areas within the basin that are affected by the reservoirs and the flow of the waters in the river. How can we do that? How can we measure it? How can we monitor it? And how can we, in the same way that we fine-tuned flood control and power generation, how can we do that for ecology and get those benefits of a healthy environment? So a lot of things, and of course there's in Canada and the United States, there's also that element of Indigenous rights, and those were not considered at all since the treaty was signed. So, but they are now. The First Nations have been recognized in the Constitution with regard to their rights. So our rights are confirmed and affirmed within the Constitution of the country. And we've had many court cases through the Supreme Court where we've been able to show legally that all of the instruments that the government claimed to have extinguished our rights did not extinguish our rights at all. So we're standing here today as Indigenous people with rights that are recognized in the Constitution and rights that are recognized through the Supreme Court. And also the 2016 Canada adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And those articles are very, very profound in terms of reconciliation and how we are going to, what are some of the challenges that we have to meet with regard to, number one, I guess the recognition within the Columbia River Treaty of the right of Indigenous people to self-determination. We live in the basin, and we have a right to be self-determining as people. And we also have rights to the land and resources that weren't recognized originally, but are now. So there's the articles are very, very clear in terms of First Nations having the right to conserve and protect the natural resources within their traditional areas, the right to develop and own and use traditional territories, the right to redress, like for the last many generations, the Columbia River Treaty, the dams and the reservoirs have been really the largest infringement on Indigenous rights that ever was. Incredible changes have been brought about by the construction of the dams and the use of the reservoirs. So we've moved over time from sort of being ignored and to now we have a voice that must be recognized and is being recognized. We have we're being consulted on, like we're being asked, what do you think about this, and this? We're actually, and I think you probably have known this, is that we've been invited into that space for negotiation. So we sit at the main Canada-US table, and we have a presence there as observers. And we've been able to expand the observation piece to actually being an active participant in the discussions at that table. And I guess one of the big pieces that is a challenge to everyone is that under the United Nations Declaration, Article 19, it says that governments must get the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations or Indigenous people before they move on to these large agreements, before they sign them. So that's something that it's there, and certainly a different role for Indigenous people. We have many interests that are being put forward by our side, because that's, I think, only we can determine what our interests are, our rights are. And so the notion that we are the first peoples in the Columbia Basin is beyond question. We've been there for thousands of years and have lived in those areas very successfully. And we have quite a collection of knowledge and information about the use of the resources, the plants, the animals, the birds. So there's over 100 species of animals that we use. So there's over 100 species of plants that we use for medicines. And we had places where we occupied, and just in terms of living, our villages. We have particular spots for fishing and medicine gathering, access to different parts of the territory. And all of those have been impacted by the existence of the reservoirs and the dams. So a lot to reconcile. The salmon for all nations, all the way from the top to the bottom of the Columbia Basin, were so important, both on the U.S. side and the Canadian side. It was sort of the lifeblood of those communities everywhere. So certainly, that's an area of a real prime area of interest, is how do we get this salmon back? It's a challenge that's been there for quite a while. And of course, that's where we require quite a bit of coordination between the US and Canada, because the dams in the US, of course, don't permit the passage of salmon upstream. And although they're working on that. And of course, that's half of the equation. And the other interest is, how do we successfully get the young salmon down to the ocean again once they spawned in the various places? And all kinds of challenges about the environment that exists now as a result of the dams, and how we can actually successfully have salmon thrive again in the system. So. And I think that's the crux of our interests as Indigenous people, is how do we get those interests on the table and in some significant way agreed to within the renewed Columbia River Treaty? So we've lots of certainly for me, it's been a quite a learning curve. There are so many details when you get down to the details of operating plans, 1 year, 5 year, and then how do you actually do the planning that will get us what we want? And that's, I think, a big part of the Canada-U.S. discussions. The relationship that we have with the U.S. tribes is very positive, especially around salmon. For a number of years, we've had conferences and workshops about how to reintroduce salmon. So we share a lot of information, and of course, we have a very similar approach to dealing with land and resources, where we recognize the value of having those natural resources and have an obligation and responsibility to ensure the health of the ecological areas, salmon, wildlife, plants, and people. So we have continued discussions about, in a renewed treaty, how can the Indigenous people continue to support one another in either formal or less formal ways. But we know that we're going to continue to have these relationships if we're going to be successful in meeting our objectives. Working together is certainly the best way to go.
Thank you for that. And let me ask you, when we think about ecological health, when we think about the rights of the Indigenous people and reconciling these things, can you imagine a world in which the dam continues to exist, but also the salmon, you talked about the flows of salmon going both ways. You said you're working on that. Do you feel like there's a way to get there that's short of kind of undoing the dam altogether? Can those things live together, and is that part of the negotiation?
It's certainly a part of the negotiation, the salmon part. And actually, the salmon are under a different plan. It's the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative. And that's the governments in Canada, BC, and First Nations, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have come together to see what they can do to reintroduce salmon into the Canadian side of the border. And so there's a lot of planning that's going in there, just to what's the potential now. And they have a strategy for that. They've got a lot of science happening. And of course, there have been initiated discussions with the U.S. Side to see what's necessary on that side in order to get salmon to the border and then back and forth. So, so that's still there. We know that if we can get the salmon sort of over the dams in the U.S. and Canada, we have some considerable potential to have salmon reintroduced into the system north of the border. So, looking positively at it, there's a lot of challenges, and it's certainly a topic of discussion, sort of on the bigger picture as well.
Well, Mr. Nathan, let me ask you this question a slightly different way. I hope I can do this without seeming to just rely on sort of colonial names, but can you talk a little bit about your geography? Where are you in the world, and where are you in relation to what we call the Columbia River, so that people have a sense sort of on the map how you're situated? I think that's something that doesn't always come through for people who aren't map people.
Just the Secwépemc people, or the First Indigenous people in general?
Start with your community and maybe some of the other communities in relation to the Columbia River Treaty Group that you were talking about. It maybe just as a starting point.
Yeah, with with the Columbia River Treaty, the Secwépemc people have traditional territory in the basin, and from south of Revelstoke, if you know where that is, down toward the border, up and around the Big Bend area, into the Invermere, Windermere areas. So we're in the upper reaches of the Columbia River, and we have one main Secwépemc community there, and that's the Shuswap Indian Band. So they're in the basin, and the Simp people that who I represent have traditional territory in the Big Bend area and north to the small village of Valemont, and it takes in all of the Kinbasket Reservoir area, which is the biggest reservoir in the series of dams. So that's certainly, we have tradition. We've got occupation sites. We've got archaeological sites. We still have sort of relationships to the land in that area. So yeah, that's and the Syilx or Okanagan also have interest in the area, and of course the Tunaka have interests in the Columbia and the Kootenay River system. So
now, as that gets close to the Canada-U.S. border, are there related communities, cousins, other groups that are actually on the U.S. side and are they as involved as you are on the Canadian side?
Well, certainly the Syilx people go right down into the United States. There's the same group, the same affiliation right through the Okanagan and into the Washington. So they've got family relations. They've got they're extending certain rights to the area for those that are living in the United States, and the Tonaka as well. They have their tribal group or their nation extends into the United States. So they've got sort of a U.S. Side and a Canadian side. So there's a good reason for talking in what we call a one river idea. Is that it's one river. Let's look at it that way. And despite it might be chopped up with the border with Canada, the U.S. and the tribal areas and the states, but it's we're looking at it as one being.
And in the negotiation, just to clarify, are there asymmetrical rights, or is there a sense that your U.S. Indigenous community relations folks that they're less at the table than you are, or have the two federal governments structured this in such a way that everyone has a voice? I guess because we do Canada-U.S. relations, I'm always interested in the comparison.
Yeah, well, in Canada, certainly we've been provided a voice all the way up and down the line in all the committee work, all of the planning, the strategies, and all the discussions we're part of. We can freely take part in and contribute. So that's something that we didn't have at the beginning, but we negotiated that, and we're very glad that we have that voice, that it's being recognized. I can't say too much about the United States. I know that the U.S. delegation includes the U.S. tribes. They as far as I know, they're advisors. So that's there. I think there is a difference formally because in the United States they have treaties, and in BC we don't. So there's a slightly different perspective, I think, taken there, and certainly the laws of the land in the United States. And this is I'm on pretty soft ground here with regard to salmon and environmental issues, species at risk. They have those elements that the laws protect resources, salmon, and such. And there are treaties about salmon. So it's a different environment altogether. And I believe that the tribes have relationships with the bodies that provide governance over the U.S. portion of the Columbia River Basin. So
This is so fascinating. What I'd like to ask you is, you've been through a lot of negotiations in your day. I'd love to ask you, based on your experience and your thoughts, how optimistic are you that the Columbia River Treaty negotiations will be completed successfully from your point of view over the next couple of years? So that's part A of the question. The other part is, how does this compare? Like, what's the with other negotiations through the course of your career? I understand that the things are different now with Canadian reconciliation efforts and all of this. But how optimistic are you that this gets concluded satisfactorily and within a, next couple of years? And B, how does this compare with other negotiations you've seen?
Oh, yeah, it's hard to compare, but we've been fairly successful in the last couple of years of First Nations or Indigenous people being able to get some of their rights exercised in terms of participating in much the same way of talking about natural resources, whether it be mining, whether it be forestry, whether it be commercial recreation, that sort of thing within our territories. So it's a lot more, I guess, balanced in our mind. Although we still have some way to go, we're currently negotiating significant forestry agreements, mining agreements, energy agreements around the province, and some of them they're being agreed to and inked in and negotiated by First Nations, and the benefits and the responsibilities for shared decision making are becoming real. So it's taken a long time, and with the Columbia River Treaty, in terms of time, I thought it was going to move along quite quickly in terms of identifying issues and coming to an agreement, and okay, we'll meet you halfway here or there.
Yeah.
But we're still moving, I believe, in terms of the value of that water as it moves from place to place, and the challenge of getting beyond just the power generation and the flood control. And that's how much value is there in protecting the environment. How much value is there in returning salmon, and how do you fine tune the system to accommodate those interests? And the Indigenous voice is also something that's really important to deal with in terms of how do we fit into some future governance arrangement where we continue to have a voice in how the resources in our traditional territories are being used. And the water is a big one. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic, or else I don't think I would be here. I'm optimistic that we're going to have some clarity. We're leading the research. The Indigenous side in Canada is leading the research in ecological values. So we're taking a look at the rivers, the reservoirs, the streams, the plants and the animals, and doing the research in terms of what do we think that it will take to make that environment or that ecological area healthier through some way of changing the operations of the system. And that's the key thing. How do we change it from what it is now? And it's mainly, I guess, going back to flood control and power generation. How do we adjust the levels of the reservoirs to accommodate some interest? Like, one of the big things for us, as we found out, is that we have burial sites, archaeological sites that have been eroded by the wave action and up and down of the reservoirs. So is there anything that we can do to protect those areas right now? It's the same with the plant and animal species, the medicines and that sort of thing. How do we change the operation of the system to accommodate those interests? So we're doing modeling right now. We've put these pieces into a computer, develop a number of scenarios, run the computer, and then look just to say, okay, in order for us to have the healthy fish or birds or whatever, the water should be at this level, it should flow at that rate, it should be at that temperature. And so you put that in and compare that to what exists right now and what has to be changed. That's, to me, the big thing. And we're getting the science in line so that we can actually say, this is how much we need, how much water we need for this purpose at this time, and then related to the water that flows over to the U.S. border in real time throughout the year. Another big issue is climate change. I mean, holy smoke. There's a huge body of water. And of course, there are many, many experts. And there's a lot of people concerned about that. Just the change in the climate and what does that mean for the water flows? Because we have glaciers that are melting and all of that, and extreme weather events where the flow of water is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And so, yeah, it's expanding the information base to accommodate those pieces is a challenge for everyone. And one of the big pieces is hydroelectric power. Where are the electrical power needs into the future? So we have hydroelectric power, then we have nuclear power, and we've got wind power, and we've got solar power. And what are the needs and the patterns of use of people going forward? Because that'll drive a lot of the turning the dials on the levels of the water and that sort of thing. So that's a very critical piece to think about. And of course, in BC, we have other options around hydroelectric generation that are being developed right now. So how does that impact the Columbia Basin, which provides a very significant part of the power or hydroelectric power needs of the citizens?
Yes, it does.
So, Mr. Matthew, I could tell that you're an educator because you're a very good explainer of things, and I know that's been a big part of your background. I guess I'm interested in a sort of practical challenge, which is how are you preparing, I guess, the younger generation of people in your First Nation to pick up the reins and be the next generation of negotiators? This is one of those things, and I can just tell that you've learned a lot at the negotiating table from all the iterations of these experiences. So how do you prepare the next generation to be able to advocate for themselves and participate in processes like this Columbia River Treaty negotiation to kind of learn from what you've done in the past and kind of build on that? Is that something that you're apprenticing people, or do you have an approach that you've taken? I'm really curious as to whether you're getting better and better at this.
We know that's really important. And I don't think we're doing as good a job as we want to think, because we have a number of negotiators, and we have lots of negotiators in different areas, but it takes a fair bit of time and thought to participate effectively in this particular negotiation. So yeah, we could be, should be training more younger people to step in. And what we know, and we have the experience, is that the politics on our side, it's like the general politics. We're democratically elected, and our politicians change, our leadership changes, and we're going through that phase in the Secwépemc Nation now, where a lot of those that have been sitting at the tables for years are no longer there. It's just they're no longer there, and we have a lot of new people. So that's one of the, I guess, important pieces that we know has to happen, is just to keep the representatives, the leadership, up to speed on what's going on, because there's a lot to consider, and it's we are organized in terms of a negotiation advisory team where the Canada, BC Hydro, and the three Indigenous nations sit down under an agreement, and we have our commitment to work together and the way that we're going to function. So we're quite organized that way, and what we have to ensure is that those people sitting at those different tables are oriented and brought up to speed in terms of what the current issues are. And we're moving into some new areas as well, which in terms of governance, thinking about, well, how do we really want to be involved in this sort of stuff? Because it's another layer of decision making. And do you want to just have your values in there and have some other people exercise, implement them, or do you want to have your hand on the wheel all the time? That's capacity wise, I think for Indigenous people, it's something we have to think about.
Well, hopefully some of your young people and young people across Canada will hear the podcast and get a sense of both how challenging it is, but also how interesting and really beneficial it can be to the community. We'll inspire some folks who may not want to pick up a textbook but enjoy a podcast. That's our audience across the continent.
Yeah, we have salmon releases where we involve young people, so they're there to witness and participate in salmon issues. We've got workshops and conferences that young people are now taking a role in, which will lead, we believe, to good things. So, yeah.
Well, you raised so many interesting issues, and the last one, the question on governance, I think is, and your capacity, or First People's capacity to be at the table and negotiating all of these things forevermore. Hadn't thought of that. So we're coming to the end of our time here, and we're so grateful. I've got a selfish question I'd like to ask you, which is, based on your experience, broadly, if you were to give Chris Sands and me advice about a topic that we should look at for Canusa Street for this podcast, what might it be? Because the Columbia River Treaty is awfully important, and we'll continue to talk about that. And we talk about all kinds of issues that face Canada and the United States. But if you wanted to put your 2 cents in, what would you ask us to look at?
Well, I'm just speaking for what I would be interested in,
yeah,
and that's more information about the approach that the United States is taking to environmental protection, preservation, and sort of that whole ecological footprint that's there as a result of the dams, and what plans do the governments have there, and without getting into anything deeper than that, because that's going to determine over time, I think, the extent to which we can get these new issues introduced in a formal fashion, because it has to be nailed down quite precisely in terms of the functioning of that water system and what accommodation is there to ecological interests is going to be one of the big things, because it's balanced by probably getting less power and maybe a little more flood risk as a result of attending to these other interests.
I love that suggestion, and actually, I think it applies not only to the Columbia River Basin, but I think we could explore how the U.S. in particular, but also Canada, approaches these environmental and ecological issues right across the boundary waters. The Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, as Professor Sands will tell us, established a lot of the ways we look at how we govern our border. It's, the Canada-U.S. border, I think, is 40% water, right? So I like that suggestion a lot. And let me just say how grateful we are to you for joining us today. I learned a lot. I hope you'll continue to be willing to talk with us from time to time over the next few years as this negotiation and others move forward. But let me just, on behalf of Chris Sands and our listeners, just say thank you and how grateful we are to you.
Cook Stem, thank you for inviting me. I always enjoy an opportunity to talk about our issues because I think they're not that well known, especially outside of our country. So thank you for this, and what you're doing in terms of public education, I think is really great.
Well, I thank you. And you're right. These issues aren't well known. And I like to say what I don't know about these things could fill an encyclopedia. So thank goodness for Chris Sands, who knows a lot and asks good questions. So we're glad to be in this journey together.
Scotty is a flatterer, but I think in your case, she's actually accurate. So thank you very much, Mr. Matthew. Really appreciate your time.
Well, I keep learning, Chris. I love learning. And it's so easy to do in a podcast format. I mean, where were podcasts when you and I were coming along? I don't know. I don't think I would read books about treaties, but talking to people, listening to people, especially somebody as informed and thoughtful as the chief, I think it was just terrific.
I agree. And I think one of the things that's been interesting about the Columbia River Treaty series of podcasts we've done, and for listeners who are just listening to this one, go back. We've had some really good ones so far on this topic, is that each person we've interviewed has brought a very different perspective, which of course is normal, but they see this in a different way. And Nathan Matthew kind of brought the whole rich history of First Nations, Canada, the United States, American Indigenous communities together in this moment, while also looking forward to what may be coming around the corner. These issues are complex. At the surface, you can say, okay, it's a treaty, it's about power, it's about flood control, but the human connection to these agreements, the fact that Canada-U.S. relations is not just this high-level friendship, but that it gets into the nitty-gritty. It gets down to the street level, including the Canusa Street level, where it really matters in daily lives of people. And I think it's one of the really great things about this podcast is being able to get to people and get that perspective. It's just, you can't beat it, and you can't substitute a textbook for it, as you said.
Well, that's right. And, the other thing that strikes me is if you and I were having this discussion even 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know that the First Nations perspective would be automatically included, right? Mm-hmm. And not just for this discussion of Columbia River, but remember the podcast we did on the Carbon Hub proposal in Alberta, which, by the way, since we had that podcast, that proposal was approved, was green-lighted. And we had a First Nations tribal leader on that podcast, as well as the corporate folks, talking about, his partnership and what that means for his particular nation. And so this is new for old folks like you and me, and it's maybe well overdue. But I'm glad we are continuing to have these voices, and we'll continue to do so.
Well, and it's the power of podcasting technology that allows us to connect to people on the other side of the continent, and give them a voice that they wouldn't have had if we had to be intrepid reporters on the ground with a microphone and a tape recorder. So I know that's going to make me sound old, but you talk about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even had the technology. So maybe it's bringing us together in a small way, and that's a great thing.
Well, that's exactly right. And so we will continue to come up with hopefully interesting and illuminating items to discuss on Canusa Street. And I look forward to continuing the conversation, my friend. It's always fun.
Me too. Looking forward to the next time we'll be back on Canusa Street, Scotty.
All right.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.